I just want to say good evening to everyone dialing in from Asia, and good morning to Professor Ma in New Haven and others joining from North America or that side of the globe. Welcome to this Yale Center Beijing event. I am Carol Lee Rafferty, the Executive Director of the Center and a Yale College alumna. As many of you know, the Yale Center Beijing was founded in 2014 as Yale University's only university-wide center outside of its US campus. And throughout the year, almost every other day, we host events such as these, where we convene leaders from academia, business, politics, arts, and sciences to talk about the most pressing and interesting and important topics facing our world. Today, we are very delighted to have Yale professor Song Ma with us to talk about, through the lens of big data, education and career choices. I think this is a very timely talk, especially for those of you who are in the process of applying to university or contemplating studying in the US and your future, because Professor Song Ma and his colleague from Yale, also an economist, Professor Barbara Biasi, they have done this very, very interesting study using big data and machine learning to tell you more about how your education and career choices may impact your future. So I'm going to do a really quick introduction of our great speaker today. Song Ma is an assistant professor of finance at the Yale School of Management. His main research interests are corporate finance, entrepreneurial finance, innovation, and business law. His research has been featured in top academic journals, such as the Journal of Political Economy, Journal of Finance, and he has won numerous research awards. His research has also been referenced by legislators and policymakers around the world, including the Federal Trade Commission, competition commissions around the world. He was also recognized as Poets and Quants 40 Under 40 Best Business School Professor in 2021 and teaches a popular course on entrepreneurial finance at Yale SOM. But this topic, you may think, oh, this is very different from what he usually speaks about. And the reason why I have asked him to share about why college education matters and how to make your best choices is because I heard his really brilliant talk a month or two ago when he was presenting to an audience that consists of university leaders at Tsinghua University and Yale University. And I just thought this is very interesting and timely and useful information that we can share with more people. So without further ado, let's welcome Professor Song Ma. And after his presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, for the very kind introduction. And for those of you who are logging from China, 大家晚上好. I'm going to speak in English, but if you have any questions, please feel free to ask either in English or Chinese or whatever dialect that you feel like I could understand. And with that, I will first motivate a little bit about my talk and hopefully can provide some useful information to you. I think Carol actually left the introduction with a very, very interesting lead for me. We definitely didn't coordinate, but I thought it was really, really useful. That is, first, let me introduce myself. Like, I'm assistant professor of finance. I'm also affiliated with Yale SOM Entrepreneurship, Yale Law School, and National Bureau of Economic Research. And my research interests in innovation, entrepreneurship, and so on. So, well, the question is, why does a finance professor choose to talk about education with everybody? Right? I mean, I'm not an education economist or majored in that and so on, but why it is important? Why am I interested in it? Because in essence, in my mind, education is an investment. And for those of you, I see a lot of young faces here, and I know that you're at the break point of thinking about, okay, where should I go? What should I do with my career, with my education choices, and so on? In your mind, you're making a calculation. You're making a calculation about what's the potential cost and what's the potential return. And this was never in economists' mind until roughly 1950s by this Chicago economist, Gary Becker, and who actually got to this human capital theories that was thinking, okay, every human behavior regarding your education, healthcare, jobs, and so on and so forth is a type of investment. You need to trade off the cost and return. And with that in mind, I would say, okay, let's actually give it a little bit of economist spin in this problem. And when we think about this as an investment choice, then it becomes a very weird type of investment. Why? Think about this. If you invest in stocks, okay, at least you know a lot about those stocks and they're going to keep you updated about your stocks. For example, if you want to invest in, let's say, Multi, you get their annual reports, you got their quarterly reports, you know their past stock performance, returns in the past year, volatility, product quality, management quality, and so on and so forth. Basically, you know a ton about those things. Then you make the investment. But for education, in some sense, we don't know much. We perhaps got a little bit of information about school rankings, right? You can see, okay, those are school rankings, those are in those universities, those are in those locations, and so on. But there are so many useful things that would help guide your investment decision, but you kind of do not have access to. For example, do you know if you have actually 5 offers in the, you have 5 offers in front of you? What are taught in the classroom in those universities, and how do they compare across different schools? Which professors that you have access to teach useful stuff that will actually, in the end, could be very useful for your career and academic choices in the future? And in general, what kind of curriculum give you the best career choices in the future? And remember, the answer to those questions might not be uniform across different people, because with different, given your different backgrounds and goals and so on, maybe the best courses and best fit would be very, very different, right? And also, what kind of career path should you decide to follow your education and so on? I mean, those are all useful questions, but we just do not have access to. And think about how costly it is to make the investment in education. This kind of become a necessary, useful information for us to provide if some school like us want to convince you, oh, Yale is a great university, but why it is the case? How can I tell you what that is the case, as to tell you this is a good investment for your future and human capital? Okay. So in this talk, I'm going to try to cover 2 pieces of research that is related to this. And the first one is the major one that I will talk about, is also what Carol motivated with, is a piece of work that I did with my colleague here, an education economist by Prof. Biasi, to look into university education through their curriculum. And we're going to try to quantify the usefulness of education contents and its determinants, and document the link between education contents and future student outcome. Okay, this is a work in process that we can hopefully transform them into some sort of a ranking. But at this moment, it's not at that stage yet. But I will show you some to help you, guide you to think about this problem. The second one is kind of at the intersection of education, that which what I talk about, and my general topic of interest of study, which is entrepreneurship. That is, I think a lot of students at this moment really think about entrepreneur or being entrepreneurs, start up their own companies and so on, being a short-term or long-term goal for their careers, and become and entrepreneurial activities becomes an important component in their education in universities. I'm going to revisit these problems through some evidence that I have through big data, and then try to see, okay, we know entrepreneurial education is an important part of university education, but does it mean that we really want students, or do we really want to encourage students to be entrepreneurs just in the universities? Is that good as a good use of your time and money in the early stage of your career? Okay. So with that, let's go into the first piece of work, which is what we call the education innovation gap, joined with my colleague Barbara and friend Barbara. And the idea of the paper is really like straightforward. That is, we know that we go to universities to learn about new knowledge and new ideas. right? You want to broaden your knowledge. Hopefully this knowledge will be helpful for you in the future. And also from an innovation economist perspective, higher education curriculum is one of the most important channels that they can disseminate new ideas. And this is useful because new ideas could come out of universities, coming out of corporations and so on. But if it does not go into human capital, it does not go into the talents minds, the minds like yours, and it's useless. Therefore, we want universities to be a place where new ideas and knowledge can be disseminated efficiently. But we actually do not know whether that is the case. We don't know how good universities are in incorporating new technologies, especially given the technologies are moving so fast. You could go into a university, right? You have several different options, and you go into a university, but turns out they have the reputation, but they're not up to date with their teaching curriculum. Because technically speaking, given how much that we see new, imagine your life 8 years ago and now, 10 years ago and now, how things have changed, right? And the computer science back then and computer science today are very, very different. Even finance back then and today are very different. We have very different type of securities. We have very different phenomena and so on, right? Are universities up to date? Do university curriculums equip students with frontier knowledge? And does this differ across different universities? And if you want to see whether a certain university are doing good or bad, what kind of determinants can you see, right? In terms of guiding you to think about this problem. And is this a university type of features? Is about instructors and so on, right? So the key novelty of this part of the research is that we collected and processed millions of university syllabi to answer these questions. Okay, well, if for those of you who are not familiar with the term course syllabi, is basically a few pages of documents, right, that outlines the course content as well as the day-to-day content of the course. I think at least when I was in college in China, it's called 课程大纲. So basically we collected millions of them and across the world and mainly in US, and we process them and try to compare those course content across different universities and across different professors and so on, and see what we can see. Who are teaching the useful and up-to-date stuff? And does teaching useful and up-to-date stuff help? Okay. So what do we do with the data? So we collected a gigantic amount of data that can help us to answer these questions. First, we got this course syllabi, and we can parse the course content for each course. And also we have a way to evaluate whether the things that are taught are up to the frontier or not. Okay, for example, if they're a computer science course that are teaching slightly newer language, like for example, an intro to computer science class that teaches newer language like Julia and so on, versus a course that teaches, let's say, Visual Basic, which is like a 30-year-old language and so on. Okay, so I mean, this is just an example. And maybe for general linear algebra, or do you actually introduce more up-to-date examples to it? Or a basic statistics course, do you introduce stuff that can help you connect to machine learning and new stuff in AI and so on, because that is the base for that? Or do you still use the very old examples about like populations and so on? So kind of we'll have a way to measure the difference between course syllabi and frontier. I will get to that in a minute about how specifically we did. And then we also collected a lot of information about universities. We get the information about university, instructors, and so on. And we also get information about students, student demographics, and also how well they did after they take certain courses, right? And in that way, we actually have data to see whether students experiencing certain type of educational content actually did well in the future versus not. This is the type of information that we think would be great to have especially for students who are at the stage of choosing their education, path. Because again, as I said, if you try to buy a stock, you know a lot about them, you know their past performance and so on, but we kind of don't know much about the university. This is a way to actually get us closer to those kind of information. So just to give you a sense of each of the syllabus in this, okay, you can see this is a typical Yale syllabus, okay? This is typical Yale syllabi. And there are tons of information in it. There's a course number, there's a course title, and this is a terms, and there's like the professors, the teaching assistant, there's a course description that basically tells you what typically this course looks like, the textbook, the required readings, and there's a course structure that gives you a day-by-day run of those things. The first day we're going to teach this, and the second day, if you're in the university, this should not be strange to you or new to you. But for those of you who are in high school and so on, this is the type of things that you are going to deal with very, very soon. And in total, we collected 7 million course syllabi. And for the study that I'm going to show you, we focus on the US. For 20 years, between 1998 to 2018, we got nearly 2 million syllabi that covers 800 US institutions, typically the fairly top ones. And we cover all kinds of different fields. And we parse the content into basic info, instructor name, course description, teaching schedule, catalog, references, assignments, and so on, right? So we get all those information together with a lot of information that I showed you here about universities and students as well. Then what do we do in order to measure whether certain things are useful versus not? So the way that we have is to construct this measure called the education innovation gap. And the idea is to compare course content with the frontier publication in the scientific field, okay? And we are going to say a course has a higher gap if it is less similar to the newer research, but more similar to the old research. But it would have a lower gap, okay, if it is more similar to newer research, meaning that it's good, right? If it is closer. And I gave you the example. My wife actually is also a professor here at Yale. She teaches Introduction to Statistics. She's a statistician. She's in the statistics department. And if you ask her what kind of statistics courses that she took when she was a student 12 years ago, and ask what kind of courses that she teaches today, it's actually quite different. Why? Because you introduce new type of topics to connect students to different frontier knowledge. Right now, she put in a lot more categorical data, like logistic regressions and so on and so forth, or splines and so on. All those things are preparing the students for computer science, data science, as well as machine learning, AI, that a lot of students are quite useful to. For a lot of students, those are quite useful to them. So this is kind of the idea that we have in mind, but how can we actually do that? We're going to apply an approach that use textual similarities between syllabus and the top publications that we collected. Basically, we know what are frontier knowledge through scientific publications, through job postings, right? Because when companies and so on are putting their job postings online, we know their text, and you will get a sense of how what kind of skills are desired on the labor market. And we can see whether university courses are actually equipping students or preparing students for those kind of stuff, right? And then we're going to construct the education innovation ratio gap ratio as the ratio of similarity measures between my similarity to the old versus new, okay? To give you a sense, we have a syllabi, we have the frontier knowledge, then we're going to project them through a certain type of scientific dictionary to categorize them into vectors. And we're going to weigh the vectors through their relative frequency. Those are all part of the natural language processing. And then we can look at the cosine similarity measures between those kind of documents, which gives us, okay, the gap as the measure of, okay, how similar I am with 15-year-old knowledge versus past year's knowledge. And as you can imagine, as this gap goes up, it means that my similarity with the old knowledge are really high. I'm teaching a lot of old stuff versus the new ones. The gap would be high, right? But reversely, if the gap is low, it means that I teach a lot of new stuff. Therefore, the numerator is really, sorry, the denominator is really high. In that case, it will be a lower gap course, which is what we consider to be quite useful. Okay, it will be quite useful. So with this technique in hand, what did we show? Okay, first, you perhaps don't have, even though in the end we are going to try to create a ranking based on that and so on and so forth, but you perhaps do not have those kind of information. How can you find signals? Okay, how can you find signals from universities can help you to extract information about what kind of universities have a lower gap, which is basically universities can equip you with up-to-date technologies. And we're going to ask 3 questions. First, how should we think about school level differences in terms of providing access to frontier knowledge to their students? That is, how can we find such signals? How can we find those 蛛丝马迹 that can actually help to guide you to find universities with those kind of lower gap traits? And then second, we want to look at, okay, professors are doing research and so on. In fact, a lot of your tuitions goes into your professor research budget. And then how should we think about professors' research? Is that going to be a useful thing that could complement their teaching, that could eventually benefit you? And also when you, for example, in the universities, right? What kind of courses should you pick, right? Like based on the professor's research profile, their titles, and so on and so forth. What are really useful to you? And then the third is, how should that actually useful? Because I guess a lot of students at least think like going to college has a bunch of consumption value in it. That is, it's just for fun to meet people and so on. I do not dispute with any of that. But do we at least know the course content would at least matter a little bit to your career outcomes? And specifically, for what kind of students those outcomes are, like those links between course or your education with the outcome are useful. And I can preview to you a little bit. If you come from a family, right, that is already well connected and quite wealthy and comfortable, perhaps course content to your future outcome is not that important. But if you are determined and your family background forces you, right, to actually just need to earn your own career and really fight very hard to get a bright future, then the course content is going to be really helpful. Okay, I'm going to go to details to some of that, but I'm going to now show you the 3 findings that I have. The first is access to frontier knowledge. And we basically link the education innovation gap with a bunch of public school characters, okay? And first, as you can see, public universities, okay, generally has a slightly higher gap, okay, slightly higher gap. And labor arts college, even though you think they are liberal arts, they're teaching potentially the classics and so on, you do not see them to have a higher gap compared to other universities, mainly because they highlight teaching quite a bit and their professors really spend a lot of time crafting their teaching materials, right? For those of you who are worried about liberal arts college teaching very outdated stuff, no, that does not seem to be the case. In fact, they teach quite up-to-date stuff despite their concentration on classics. Research intensity really, really matters. That is, if you know this so-called Carnegie R1, which is the research intensity of a university, that is a very key determinant of what kind of courses that you can get, because you can see Carnegie R1 research intensive universities has a systematic lower gap, which is closer to the frontier compared to other universities. And money matters, as not surprisingly, You can see universities' endowment, instructional expenses, instructional salary, as well as research expenses is a very, very precise predictor of the education innovation gap, okay? And also, if you actually try to look at school rankings, you can see people call those Ivy or Ivy Plus, which is the Ivy League plus 4 elite universities, Duke, Chicago, MIT, and Stanford, and highly selective and selective. You can see that it is those universities are called those universities for some reason, right? They are providing courses that are better than the rest of the universe, okay? The rest of the universe, okay? And the students with different demographics actually have access to those kind of different universities as well. And you can see, well, okay, all those dots, yes, the sign seems to be suggesting there's some relationship, but what's the economic magnitude, right? Like, how should we think about how much did we lose in terms of going into different universities? Like, yes, they're teaching different stuff, but how much are these, okay? And we did a simulation-based quantification. Basically, how should we think about the difference across different universities? How much did we lose, for example, for the same course, okay? And some are teaching older stuff and some are teaching new stuff. How much older stuff did we actually lose in this? What does it mean? If you actually compare Ivy plus other schools, and the gap between them is equivalent to a 9% course content difference. In terms of some, like the other schools are teaching 10% older stuff, while the slightly more selective universities are picking 10% newer stuff compared to the other universities. And similar things, you can do the calculations for the endowment, for public universities, and so on and so forth, okay? I mean, this does not mean that you shouldn't go to those universities. Remember, there's a cost difference across that as well, right? Because some universities are just easier as well as like less costly to go to. And that's still very, very good. But if you decide to go there, make sure that you know that you want to make sure that what you learned is still up to date and so on. Maybe reach out actively outside to know what you can get out there, okay? And the second is, how should we think about, like, okay, after you go into a university, what kind of courses, whose course should you take? Which professor's course should you take in order to get good exposures to new knowledge? Of course, you should always trust reputation, because the people ahead of you took the course, they know how useful certain things are. There's no problem with that. But if you actually want to know, okay, if I just look at it, or you are just selecting universities, you're looking at the university teaching profile, what should you pick? Faculty research quality is the #1 predictor of the course content, okay? And that is, the professor's research productivity is a strong predictor of how well the content will serve you in the future. Here we can measure the correlation between the education innovation gap with the research productivity of faculty members in terms of number of publications, their general impact based on the citations they received, as well as their scientific grants that received from different agencies. You can basically see the education innovation gap, okay, is much lower with university professors that have a much higher citation or research impact, okay? Basically, teachers who typically do better research, they actually do better teaching as well, okay? They do better teaching as well. It's not like the general sense like, oh, the teacher who does good research are nerds, cannot communicate, and so on. No, it's no longer the case. Just to know that when you pick university professors, which courses, and so on. And also, there's this general trend in US higher education in general, that we have a lot of adjunct lectures in universities, right? I mean, my cousin actually goes to a very famous university in the US, right? And then she is applying to graduate school at this moment. And I look at the transcript and I was shocked by how many adjunct lectures and professors courses that she had to take, okay? And if you actually look at the current composition, you can see this is nearly half of university staff, teaching staff at this moment, okay? And what does it mean? the problem with that is that if you actually look at the education across job titles, the tenure track faculty members that are research active have a much lower one, particularly the young professors. Okay, the young professors at this moment are where you have the best bet on to some extent. Of course, the senior professors can give you different type of insights, but if you say, okay, what does the data tell us? The professors who are still young and very research active are where they're actually introducing a lot of new contents. You can balance that with a lot of senior professors who can give you connections, networks, as well as basic guidance and advice and so on, but make sure that you should trust with some of the research active young faculty members when you pick your courses and so on, because that's a great predictor of how good the contents will be. And also, does education, okay, I had tried to convince you that you need to really take care of your education content, where what you learn in universities. But does it even matter? The answer is yes. What you learn actually matter. It's not only the bodies that you know in the universities that actually matters, or you get a diploma from a reputable university that matters. Yes, they matter quite a bit, but what you learn really matters as well. A one standard decline gap, that is one standard deviation, a standard unit of decreasing, getting closer to the gap, is associated with 8% increase in graduation rates and 7% increase in your future income annually. Okay, this is a very, very big jump. And particularly if you are from more humble background, where you're not going to use family network, family wealth, and so on and so forth to give you a kickstart of your own career. In that case, having learned more useful stuff is particularly useful to you. Okay, it's particularly useful to you. It's very easy to understand this. Why? Because you are those kind of students are the people who are going to the interview room to really show your muscles and your skills and so on in order to get the job without additional help. Okay, therefore, learning useful contents is particularly important for them. And for those kind of kids, the jump in terms of income is even higher. It's like 10% rather than 7%. Okay, it's a very, very important. This is also related to your future graduate school admissions and so on. So I don't have time to show any of that. But in summary, what I try to do in this type of research is basically to tell you, if you think about your education, really think about what you're getting out of universities, and course content is very, very important. Really, no matter where you are, you're picking universities or you're already in the university and try to pick courses and so on. Make sure that you keep this thing in mind, and hopefully some of those research are useful to you. I'm running a little bit over time, but let me spend 3 minutes on the second topic that I really care about. And I just want to give you my perspective on this, just in case some of you are really thinking about this issue. That is, well, so a lot of the students at this moment are thinking about universities as a jump board for your startup activities, for your entrepreneurial efforts down the road. I want to be an entrepreneur. University is a place I'm going to meet my partner, having resources, get help with professors, and use the time, because you were in high school, you're super busy. Now I'm an adult, I'm in university. Let me start up my company and so on. And not surprisingly, entrepreneurship education is now, as a result, important components in higher education. I, in fact, teach entrepreneurial courses, and Yale has a ton of resources, and similarly in other universities as well. And many students come into the university with this explicit goal to start up a company. Is this a good educational investment? Both in terms you're paying $60,000 a year tuition in the top university in the US, and you're spending the very, very valuable time between the years of 18 to 22, okay? In order to do that, is that on average a good investment? That's the question I want you to ask yourself, especially after trading off the returns and risks. Maybe the answer is yes, because I guess those are the people that you have in mind. Maybe we are a different type of generation. You have different idols, but these are the people that I grew up knowing as university students who come to universities and start up the companies. Of course, they all dropped out of college. That's a different story. But this is for those of you who are really kind of young, just to tell you who they are. This is Bill Gates, right? Microsoft. This is Steve Jobs. He's no longer with us, and he created Apple. And this is Mark Zuckerberg, who is not in a particularly good position at this moment, but he created Facebook. And maybe the answer is yes. You thought, okay, we have those kind of good examples and so on. But the problem is the good examples bias your beliefs about how creative college kids are. I mean, let's look at bigger data rather than only 3 examples that can motivate you. This is the individual innovation, individual's innovation and creative experience curve. And what does this tell us? Is that, okay, if we look at all the scientists who got Nobel Prize, okay, in the past, and then look at their top creative work that got them there, okay, where does this creativity peak lines up in terms of their age? And the answer is between 38 to 40, okay? And that is why, because that is the place where you got enough experience and polished your creativity and you still have the energy and you got there. I'm trying to say, okay, this is perhaps some signal for you to say, okay, maybe the earlier age here is not where the creativity really lines up or the place where you should think about starting up. And I can give you even a more direct evidence of curves for entrepreneur success lining up with ages. This is from a different paper. But if you look at the overall US startup founders, overall, they are still kind of lining up between 38 to 42. And overwhelmingly, the founders of the top 1% growth startup, meaning that the particularly good startups, they start up much later as well. Okay, that is the place where you earn experience and so on and so forth, and networks, and after even graduate school and so on. And here, similarly, this is what they call the 17-year effect, 17-year effect, not 70, oh my God, 17-year effect. That is, among the successful startups, overwhelmingly, it comes from people who created their startups between 35 and 44. Okay, that is roughly 17 years after you graduate from college. Okay, and then all I try to give you this evidence for is to let you to think about this problem. Okay, you are going to get a lot of entrepreneurial education, which is great, and this is what universities are doing, and I think it is a great thing that we do both in college, in business school, in engineering schools, and so on. I teach you courses in all 3 of them. But I think preparing your education in entrepreneurial fields is different from pushing you or encouraging you to do it right away, graduating from college, okay? Every time you make that big shift in terms of your choice, you say, I'm going to spend 2 years of my college life, the time and money to do certain efforts in entrepreneurial endeavors. It's a huge investment. It's huge costly. You can think about how much you can achieve in 2 years and how much money that you use, okay? Think about the trade-offs and think about the exposed return that I showed you. And I think it's just something to be mindful of, okay? So, but overall, I hope you learned something useful through this talk. I'm sorry I ran out of time a little bit. And I look forward to hearing some of your thoughts. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask again, either in English, if you feel comfortable, or in Chinese, which I totally welcome, as well as any dialect that you you prefer using, as long as I can understand. Thank you very much again.
Wow, thank you very much, Professor Ma. That was really, really fascinating. I see some likes and enthusiasm in the chat box as well. So I'm sure, you know, for those of you who have questions, you can start raising your hands or typing them into the chat box. Oh, great. We have a first question from Cliff Ye.
Professor. It's good to hearing from you again. My name is Clive. I went to SOM MBA 19. So I've taken your entrepreneurial finance class. I have to say it's one of the very practical and valuable course I've taken at business school. So it's great to hear from you again.
Thank you.
It's a very interesting research. And somehow it came as a surprise to me that the Ivy League actually has a narrow innovation gap, because intuitively, I would think Ivy League, at least the colleges, they're not occupation driven. As a matter of fact, our president once said, it's a shame if we teach the students skills, rather than thinking. So I'm just thinking, try to reconcile why the Ivy League actually has a narrow innovation gap. I wonder whether the professional schools will play a role in this regard, because at business school we have seen accounting classes or finance classes, there are always very young faces from Yale College. So when maybe the professional schools will provide a avenue for Ivy League students to learn the technical skills. And I think the best business schools also mostly are Ivy League schools, except Princeton. So I would be very curious to see whether Princeton students, their innovation gap, whether there's a difference between their innovation gap with other Ivy League college students. So just a curious mind. Thank
Perfect.
you.
This is great. So I think this is something that we looked into a little bit as well, which is so that's actually where I highlighted liberal arts as well, which is also a place where they highlight classics, highlight about ways to think, and so on. I want to make 3 points here. So the first point I want to make is that teaching classics doesn't mean I teach old stuff, right? Things evolve, right? Things evolve. Even, for example, thinking about discussions about history, discussions about like even the hot topics at this moment about social justice, about racial diversity, relations, and so on and so forth. Thinking about the more classic stuffs about how about like those kind of more humanity related stuff. There are new views that are often introduced and into those kind of into this kind of topics. And most of the studies that I showed you is within a topic. Basically, we should accept that engineering generally have a lower gap compared to, let's say, humanity or history majors and so on. But within that, okay, different universities differ in terms of how quickly they can incorporate up-to-date stuff into this kind of course teaching and so on. And as a matter of fact, that's why I said those instructor quality is very, very important. Okay, it's very, very important. That is, in a lot of universities, you just have professors who are so good that they cannot allow themselves to teach you outdated stuff. They have such a high standard on themselves, and they do not want to kind of teach you like useless and stuff. Therefore, they select all those things. And that's kind of the first comment I want to say. That is, you should think about this as a within field change. That is, I'm comparing, let's say, engineering with engineering across different universities, history versus history in the other universities. And of course, Yale has a higher history a component in it. But even compare history, we're just doing a slightly better job in terms of incorporating up-to-date stuff, right? That's the first comment. The second comment, actually, I really appreciate that you asked this question. Is like it gave me an opportunity to actually give you this perspective of mine to some of you. I'm not trying to force an opinion on you, okay? But I'm trying to give you this perspective. That is, there's this argument about, oh, universities are places that teaches you how to think, okay? Rather than teaches you skills or specific abilities and so on and so forth, fine, of course, go for it. But is this a one type that fits all type of story here? Is that true for all kinds of students? Is that right that we teach all students how to think? I actually am not exactly sure that is the case, right? So my feeling is that yes, for certain type of students who show their interest and intellectual curiosity and ambition, it's good to teach students how to think and so on. But maybe for certain students who have a more clear academic goal and who also have certain traits and so on, teaching them more skills might actually be a good thing, right? It's going to be good for them in terms of their career choices as an investment for college education. Okay, I just want to speak this out loud, not saying like you shouldn't learn how to think. And in fact, this is something that I totally agree that for students in certain universities, that's definitely something we should do. But just keep in mind, like might not be a rule that fits everybody. Okay, it might not be a rule that fits everybody. And the third thing I want to highlight is that professional schools generally do a much better job in terms of introducing those kind of like lower gap skills and so on. And one thing, given that you have this Yale background, that I think why Yale does better in college education in general is that the last one of the last evidence that I showed you, that is they actually ask really research active faculty members, including junior and senior, to actually teach courses. Okay, and if you like, I work here, I know that it's very hard for us to get out of teaching, like in any way. We are here, we need to teach, and we need to teach well. That's just part of the expectation. So I think that's something that is about us. Thanks for the question. Great seeing you again.
That was very interesting. Next up would be Eric, I believe from Yale NUS.
Hi, thank you, Prof, for your amazing talk. I'm Eric. I'm from Yale NUS College. I'm a freshman here, and I also have an education startup back in China that I started back in 2016 when I was in high school. So this talk has been very interesting, and I was wondering whether there's any sort of research or data into the connection between higher education and entrepreneurship, specifically in China. And across different regions, because I kind of feel like when I was doing some research into China's entrepreneurial world, especially a lot of the older generation entrepreneurs are not exactly from higher education backgrounds. Yes. And I think the sort of connection that people usually see between higher education and entrepreneurship in America may not apply to China, especially maybe in different regions in China.
Oh, that's a fantastic question. The answer is I don't know of those kind of research. I would love to know some of this research. This is really an interesting question, actually. Here's a few thoughts that really kind of came to mind. I'm just sharing some of my thoughts. This is not based on research and so on. This is nothing but my own thoughts, immediate reaction to some extent. The first thing is that I think, given the economic reform that we experienced in the past 40 some years, right? So we need to know that a lot of the evidence that we saw are from a very, very special historical period, okay? And that's actually also something that I need to remind everybody. There's this article that was floating around our colleagues in the past couple of days that is how the successful stories distorted people's beliefs. That's actually also my example of Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and Steve Jobs, and so on and so forth. All those successful stories distorted you, and you feel like all those successful stories are within reach and very, very doable. Okay. and you forgot about the specific historical period, and you forgot about the psychological bias that you have on those, and you also didn't know how many failed, right? The fact that you only highlight successful stories is kind of potentially distorting. And having said this general background, I think we have a lot of successful stories with people who didn't go to colleges and so on, and actually reach to certain career as well as entrepreneurial success. It means that personal talent really matters, but at the same time, you don't want to forget that it is just a golden period of Chinese development, that it is a testing of not only education, but the testing of your character, of your determinants, of your courage, and so on and so forth, right? I would say it's going to become much more harder to start up or to have a successful startup and so on without an education. If you actually look at the generation that we are seeing now, right, it's very, very different, right? And another thing actually specific about distorting is that people love talking about stories when somebody didn't get an education and become very, very successful. I think that's just like our preference, because the story is more dramatic, and this admittedly so, right? I mean, it's just more surprising. But you perhaps didn't know, like, let's say Zhang Chaoyang from Sohu, who was one of the first unicorns and so on. Like, he was a PhD at MIT who got physics PhD. He's one of the most genius person, and we forgot about that. I mean, because the story has become too cliche, because he's just a top student all year from the beginning of his life. It's become, oh, so yeah, sure. But you like stories that. So that is one. The second, I think, is about the trend in Chinese college entrepreneurship trends. I think this is where Carol and I saw each other again late last year. I always feel like, and also actually, if you look at the documents from the Minister of Education in China and so on, they actually explicitly say this is for training purposes. Okay, this is for training purposes. This is extremely useful. Why? Because I think having it as a training purpose is extremely proper and appropriate. If you actually say we want to have certain amount of students going to startup and so on, no way. Like, how many good ideas are out there? Like, it's not almost possible. So therefore, I think students taking the time to do some training and education, as I said, is extremely valuable, especially thinking about what could that do 10 years from your graduation. But depending on like whether you actually can do something immediately after graduating, I'm not so sure. I mean, if you have a good idea, go for it. I mean, by all means, but I'm not so sure. Just my two thoughts.
Thanks a lot. That was very interesting. Given time, I think I'll take the last question from Salvatore and Professor Ma. We also have a question in the chat box about if there's a way people could get access to your research conclusions or ranking of the schools, especially.
Yeah, I mean, the research paper is on my website, and at the same time, I can put the link in the chat as well for the research paper. But for the ranking, we are at this moment need to discuss with people about whether we can do it, because it's a much more complicated story. A much more complicated story about whether we plan to put out a ranking out there. But I will put the paper's link right now. Okay.
Great, thank you. So we'll unmute Salvatore.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the talk today. It's very informative and very inspiring as well. I have a question. It's a two-part question. The first part is, what is the next step for your first research? It's already very inspiring. So I'm thinking, what are you going to do for the next step? And perhaps, what do you discuss in your paper? in the discussions section. And also the second part is very small, is what's the name of your ranking will be?
I guess, I mean, first of all, we don't know yet whether we want to put a public ranking and so on. We perhaps would need to categorize universities into different clusters and so on. I mean, to some extent, we already show part of that in the paper. And I guess if we really need to name it, we just name it the education innovation gap, which is exactly what it is. We perhaps, I mean, Carol knows I don't like catchy titles. I only want to say what it is. It is the education innovation gap. Therefore, it's a ranking of that. And for the first one, I think this is kind of a long-term goal that we have of using those data to really kind of think about like looking into like how course selection by students really kind of adds value to our returns, and what kind of professors really created value for their students, and how universities could, I mean, reversely, right? Instead of doing ranking, actually, one thing that we really wanted to do is actually to like doing ranking is one thing of using this data, right? But a more active way of doing it is actually to work with university administrators to actually help them improve it, right? It would be great if everybody does better, rather than saying, oh, we're going to have a ranking of this and know who is good and so on. I think a more active and constructive way would be to share this with the administrators to know, like, okay, how can we do this? This is our study that shows that your university could improve here, could improve here. This is what other universities are teaching in similar courses, and so on. So in some sense, that's kind of the type of things we want to do with this research in a more active way to that as well. But that's a great question. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rory.
Well, we're running out of time for everyone, but Professor Ma, if you don't mind, I think there's one quick question from the chat box. It says, 您好，如果一个高中生想根据一些因素来了解一所大学的教学创新性如何，您能否就这些因素给他一些建议？
Should I answer in Chinese? Perhaps I should answer in Chinese. 我觉得最好的就是看大学的科研能力。这是我能够想到的，因为这个其实我在自己做这个在这个做这个科研之前都没有想到的。其实，看一个大学的科研能力还是很重要的一点，就是它决定了教师眼界的高度，然后也决定了它能够给学生带来的机会。然后，其实我们这篇 paper 到最后是有一个那个章节是在联系，就是教师或者说教师的这种创新性，或者他在课堂上教的这些东西，和之后这些学生是不是自己成为了那个非常活跃的创新者，以及去到了更高的那种 graduate school， 就是研究生项目等等，或者博士项目的一些这个关系，你都可以看到，那是一个很重要的一个因素，就是这个学校的科研能力，这个学校和老师的科研能力，以及你能选的这些课，你接触到的这些老师的科研能力，因为这些过程都是潜移默化。
那学校和教授们的科研能力是怎么来判断呢？
如果根据你不同的那个，
因为现实好像只有 rankings。
一是可以看 rankings， 二是我觉得其实大家可以dig deeper 一点的话，就是说其实可以看到的就是去到比如说你对某一个东西特别，我现在其实觉得本科生的选校或者之类的，大家可以做得更深一点，就是说其实可以进到各个自己喜欢的那些专业去看一看各个老师在做什么。如果要是这些老师在自己的 CV 或者网站上写的东西都是什么2015年、2014年，过去3-4年、4-5年都没有做任何东西之类的，你可以大概其的想象到大概是一个什么样的情况。因为现在是一个信息时代，其实大家都非常 active 的在那个更新自己的这些各方面的信息啊之类的。其实大家可以那个就是更加 那个活跃的去，或者说更加主动的去看一下不同的学校，自己感兴趣的专业、感兴趣的老师之类的，就像以前申请研究生项目似的，大家怎么做？其实现在本科生其实很多时候其实也可以这样做，因为现在的本科生其实真的是越来越主动了，所以说我感觉大家也可以考虑做这些。
Wow, that's great. 非常感谢。So we're coming to the end of this very interesting talk and discussion. What I'd like to do is invite everyone who can to turn on your cameras so that we can say thank you to Professor Ma and also take a group photo, which is what we usually do at a Zoom event to feel that we're in some way together. So please turn on your cameras, as many of you as you can. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. A big smile for Yale. Yay! All right.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Professor Ma, and to all of you who participated. We look forward to the next talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank you,
everybody.
Prof.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Lou.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.